Welcome to Trulyfit.
Noelle, thank you so much for joining the Trulyfit Podcast. Why don't you give my listeners and audience a little background on who you are and what it is that you do day to day in the health industry?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Steve. So I guess I started graduating from Stanford University with a chemical engineering degree and with honors and distinction. And then I went on to work for Abbott Laboratories in the pharmaceutical world, research and development, manufacturing, engineering, et cetera. And then I went on to get my PhD in molecular metabolism and nutrition at the University of Chicago, worked at Metagenics Institute, Metagenics company for dietary supplements, medical foods, probiotics, et cetera. And now I'm with Bened Life. I'm the chief science officer, and I work on the gut-brain axis education. I handle science and regulatory needs for the company, which focuses on neurological health and mental health needs.
Well, today, the lion's share of our conversation is going to be around the gut microbiome and all the things associated with it. I think my audience, which is, I would say 80% of people in my audience are personal trainers, people in the fitness industry, maybe some physicians, nurses, things of that nature. And the other 20% are just people who are looking for health tips, just the general population. So I want to start with more of high level talk to really get people to understand this, and then we'll go into more granular specifics. But what is the gut microbiome? How do you define it from like a layman's perspective?
Sure. So in terms of health tips, though, that you mentioned that this is all educational information. None of it's medical advice. I'm not a medical doctor. I have a PhD. In terms of the gut microbiome, we define that as the genes and the microbes in your intestine. Quite simply that. And we talk about the gut microbiome a lot instead of just the gut microbiota because most of the research identifies what is there by sequencing genes. So when you think of gut microbiome, think about the genes and all the microbes there in your gut. And those microbes include not just bacteria, but also other small organisms like fungi.
What is the difference between some of the terminology? So a probiotic, a prebiotic, a postbiotic, a psychobiotic. There's so many of these terms now floating around the industry, especially with supplements. Describe how we can differentiate them.
Yes. So the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, or ISAP, has actually provided definitions for each of these terms. And even though you may hear them used more loosely and differently from different companies, ISAP has strict definitions, and generally those should be the ones that are used and are also globally recognized by some other organizations. So for example, probiotic. It was defined by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization way back in like 2000, 2001, 2002. And it was reiterated with basically the same definition by the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics around 2014 or so. Probiotics are live microorganisms that, when administered at adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. So that means they have to be living. They have to provide a health benefit, which means there should be clinical evidence behind it. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to necessarily modify your microbiome. That doesn't mean that they are just good bacteria that have been found in the microbiome, but that they are live microbes that when you take them living, they actually have a benefit, whatever benefit that was. And prebiotics are not just food for the good bacteria, but prebiotics are substances or substrates that also are metabolized by bacteria in the gut, not necessarily probiotics, but bacteria in the gut, that also confer a health benefit on the host. And then there's symbiotics, which could include probiotics and prebiotics in a complementary or synergistic fashion. And there's postbiotics. Postbiotics are inactivated forms of the live microorganisms and or their components and or metabolites that also provide a health benefit. So in all these cases, think of providing a health benefit. So there should be clinical research. And then probiotic is live, prebiotic is the food for the gut microbes, and then postbiotic is it's inactivated. It's not live. So it could be inactivated cells, or it could be components of those inactivated cells. It might also include metabolites like the short chain fatty acids, like butyrate, et cetera.
I thought I was going to get to this later on in the conversation, but I think that leads into my next question just better, is that how is this regulated as far as like in the supplement industry versus this being a medical product? If the average person walks down their supermarket supplement shelves and vitamin shelves, they're going to see these terms all over the place. How do we trust the products? How is it regulated?
So the FDA, the US FDA, regulates food, drugs, and dietary supplements and medical foods. They do not have a strict definition for probiotics. So it's up to the company who is marketing a product as a food, a dietary supplement, a drug, a medical food, to decide, is that probiotic going down which of those regulatory pathways? And there's different levels of evidence that are required for different regulatory pathways and different processes. For example, drugs require pre-market approval. And I think the reason that the other categories don't require, the reason that many people don't think supplements are regulated is that supplements don't require pre-market approval. But the FDA can enforce and does enforce regulations around dietary supplements in a post-market manner. So you might hear about companies getting warning letters from the FDA. That's one main way in which they regulate the industry in that manner.
Interesting. The first thing I thought of though with supplements, I know a lot of people are looking for like third party tested supplements. Let's say you have a vitamin C, right? You're like, okay, is this vitamin C third party tested? So I know there's only vitamin C in here. But I would imagine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in your industry, the probiotics, prebiotics, all of this, it's much more difficult because people don't have the infrastructure to have built out the testing mechanisms for third parties. So you're doing the testing in-house.
That's correct. With probiotics, when you are measuring those live microorganisms, the gold standard typically is and has been, and it's in the Council for Responsible Nutrition / International Probiotics Association guidelines to measure as colony forming units. So CFU, colony forming units, is usually what you're going to see to measure those live microorganisms. Now the FDA does require that milligrams also be specified in certain labels, but CFU is how you measure probiotics. That's the gold standard. And not everyone has a lab that can actually have that microbiology testing set up. You have to have the media to grow and culture those microbes. You have to wait, and then you count them under a microscope. Some people will say, okay, I'm going to just open up this capsule that I bought, probiotics off the shelf. I'm going to try to culture it in yogurt at home. And then if I see some bacteria, then I think it's working. Well, that's not what we do in the lab or in the manufacturing environment, right? We have very controlled conditions. There are controlled good manufacturing practices. And that goes back to what you were saying about regulations. There are controlled good manufacturing practices that are regulated by the FDA and the Code of Federal Regulations for food, for dietary supplements, for drugs, and they're different for each category. So not only are labels and manufacturing regulated, but also there are certain ways that they're done in the lab and in these companies that we don't have from your average household tools, right?
Let's go back to some of the medical or health claims, if you want to call them health claims rather than medical claims, that these supplements make, whether it's a prebiotic or postbiotic or whatever, psychobiotic. What are some of the claims made, and then what is the science behind these claims?
So it really depends, right? Some probiotics, they may make a claim like supports gut health or supports your mood, or these different claims, right? And there are some third-party organizations that actually evaluate some of these claims in terms of looking at the scientific studies behind those particular probiotic strains, and then providing a guide of like what's the level of evidence to support their claims. And then there are also, just from the non-commercial perspective, scientists out there who evaluate, let's look at all the probiotics for gastroenterology. There's the World Gastroenterology Organization that has provided probiotics and prebiotics guidelines where you can see they actually specify these are the strains and this is the level of evidence for irritable bowel syndrome or for these other gastrointestinal conditions, right? So it really just depends on the product. It depends on the strain. And because a dietary supplement is for healthy, like not diseased conditions, and you've always seen those FDA disclaimers that they have to have, right? That says this product is not intended to cure, treat, or prevent any disease. There shouldn't be any mention of disease. However, if the probiotic strain was tested in a disease population, you can't talk about that. But there are a lot of probiotics on the market, or so-called probiotics, right, that only list, let's say, the genus and species, but not the strain. And so you don't really know what's there. So a genus would be like Lactobacillus, Bifidobacteria, and then a species would be within that genus. So Lactobacillus acidophilus. Acidophilus is the species. Lactobacillus acidophilus, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Lactobacillus plantarum. Although the naming has changed, so it's not Lactobacillus plantarum anymore, it's Lactoplantibacillus plantarum. And then with Bifidobacteria, you might see Bifidobacteria lactis, Bifidobacterium brev, etc. And then you'll usually see an alphanumeric identifier. So that might be Lactobacillus acidophilus NCFM, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. Those are some common ones that have been around for a long time. Lactoplantibacillus plantarum PS128. Okay, so there are randomized placebo-controlled trials for some of these strains, and we could talk about those. But then there are also just a collection of live cultures or live bacteria in some of these products on the market that they're calling probiotics, and you don't actually know what's in there, or if it's actually been clinically studied, or even if the CFU is still there at the end of expiration, even if it might not even have an expiration or a best by date on the product. So those are some things to look for. And it really just depends which probiotic you're talking about, like what kind of evidence is there, going back to your question.
Sure. Well, to stay on that, you can pick out any one. Are there actual like longitudinal, like you said, sort of like double blind proper studies where they're looking at lab work, or they're looking at, they're taking some sort of samples, and it's not just like a self-reporting, oh, hey, I think I had a gastro issue. I took this strain and now I feel better.
Right. So there are many examples, and if you don't mind, I'll talk about PS128. So PS128 has been studied in many different populations. If we're talking about, we could talk about autism, we could talk about many other conditions, but I think I'll talk about autism just because there are 4 clinical trials for PS128 in autism, right? And there were 3 of them were double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials in autistic children, and they showed benefits in reduced anxiety-like behaviors and such. And then one of the 4 trials was actually a real-world study. So the physicians gave PS128, the probiotic, to autistic children who were already on their other treatment plans. And then they also had other autistic children who were given other probiotics, not PS128. And then they saw that the children who were given PS128 actually had better improvements, according to the physicians, versus the physicians' ratings of children on other probiotics. So you see there's a mix of the 3 double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials plus this real-world study. And that's nice because then you see it's not just happening in a controlled study and repeatedly in multiple controlled studies, but also happening in a real-world setting. There are other examples for other populations, depending on which population you're interested. I could speak to other.
Well, let's go back to that one. I have a few questions on that. Would that fall into the category that you call a psychobiotic? And also, is a psychobiotic specifically a term that you use and your company uses, or is that sort of industry-wide?
So psychobiotic was actually defined in the literature, I believe, in 2013. So it was published, and there's a Professor Cryan is the man who basically does a lot of work in that gut-brain axis area. So I'll acknowledge him, of course, because these other scientists actually defined the term psychobiotic as basically typically probiotics, but now it's expanded to probiotics. You could have prebiotics or postbiotics that confer a health benefit for basically like psychiatric conditions, which could be gut-brain related, right? So that's why PS128 is considered a psychobiotic, because it has this gut-brain effect. In preclinical studies, it was shown to increase dopamine and serotonin in the brain in multiple types of models, like stress models, Parkinson's disease models in preclinical studies. And then in actual clinical research, it's been shown to benefit in autism in the anxiety behaviors and stereotype behaviors and some oppositional defiant aggression, etc. And not just autism, but also there was a randomized, it wasn't actually randomized, forgive me, but it was controlled. It was a 200-person anxiety study, so that people had anxiety. And so there was one control arm and then an arm that had PS128, and they showed a reduction in anxiety. And then there was also an open label single arm study in Parkinson's disease, which showed improvements in the Parkinson's disease symptoms. So you can see in all of these neurological conditions, PS128 provided a benefit. There's different levels of evidence, but that's why we believe that PS128 is a psychobiotic.
Are there different or significant differences, I should say, across populations of what our gut biome has? So for example, it's like if you were to look at like Eastern Europeans compared to what Canadians or something, like are you expecting to see like a particular strain work better with a population?
That's a very interesting hypothesis. There are differences in the gut microbiomes that have been seen like globally, especially between native indigenous peoples and more urban environments. So there are definitely theories around how people may respond differently if they have different gut microbiomes. There isn't a ton of research on probiotics for like looking, let's say we designed an ideal study for that question. We would want to look at using the same probiotic, people in radically different places, characterize all their gut microbiomes at the beginning, give them the probiotic, see how their gut microbiome changed over time, and then also measure what's your particular outcome. You know, are you looking at autism? Are you looking at irritable bowel syndrome? What kind? And we need to have the same condition, right? Because actually in many of these native indigenous populations, they don't have the same health concerns that we do. They might be still battling infectious diseases more, whereas we may have more autoimmune conditions or neurological conditions or other situations like than they do. So we have to identify the same condition that we're looking at. We have to characterize the gut microbiome, and then we have to look at the probiotics. So it would be great to do more studies where we could personalize those probiotics and really understand the interactions between the probiotic and the gut microbiome specific to those different regions and the different condition of interest.
Have they also done studies, or do you believe that this would be useful to look at someone's gut microbiome at a really young age, let's say as a toddler, and then again look at it, later into life? Because my first thought is a chicken before the egg issue, wherein are my food choices affecting my gut microbiome, or is my gut microbiome affecting my food choices, right? So like, have I developed the particular strains already if I'm an Alaskan Inuit and my ancestors have only eaten fish? Or have I now, because I started to eat all of this fish, then developed the proper bacteria?
Yes, there are greater demands for long-term longitudinal studies on the microbiome. I've heard this interest in these microbiome meetings for multiple years, for over the last several years. So there needs to be more of that type of research done. What we do know, however, is that there are many strains that are more abundant, typically at younger ages, like you're talking about toddlers, et cetera. Bifidobacterium, the whole genus, seems to be higher at younger ages, and bifidobacteria does seem to be lower in the elderly populations. There are other strains that are also associated with a drop-off over age as well. And then there are even some types of bacteria that have been associated with longevity, just by looking at differences between different populations that have like longer living people and making some of those comparisons across countries, across cultures, et cetera. So we do need to do more of these longitudinal studies and individual ones. I think there are some individuals like Larry Smarr, maybe you've heard of him, who's done probably the most gut microbiome samples of any individual, I would hypothesize. And he's really pioneered the personalization of gut microbiome sequencing and analysis. But it takes a significant number of resources to take that much data and analyze it, because not only has he been looking at the gut microbiome over time, but many of these other markers of health in his blood, like calprotectin in feces. Actually, calprotectin would be in feces, but then blood biomarkers like CRP, which is related to stress and related to overall health. It's an inflammation marker. So there could be more studies like that, but we'll need to probably decrease the cost, just like the decrease in the cost of sequencing has really advanced so much more DNA sequencing that we've been able to do, and really advanced, just sequencing the human genome, and then also the Human Microbiome Project. Once we have cost benefits and cost reductions, then I think we'll have an explosion of more of this individualized longitudinal studies over time. There is actually a cool new tool that you can basically just go to the bathroom as you normally do, and you take that wipe and you put it into a little device, and it can actually process in a very short period of time for DNA and RNA. And it's actually a much lower cost than what I've seen before. So once that can become more commercially available and more available to more people, I think we're going to be able to do a lot more of these longitudinal studies.
I know you don't do this, but obviously you've probably researched this. On the medical side, I think for C. diff treatment, they do something where they take particular strains and do that. Can you talk about that? Are there any other medical-based procedures that are currently happening or maybe happening down the road that are similar to that?
Well, so Clostridium difficile, the recurrent Clostridium difficile that is resistant to antibiotic treatment and keeps blooming in just actually because sometimes the antibiotics just wipe out all the other good bacteria, has been treated with fecal microbial transplant, which is basically taking feces from donors, from healthy people, and then processing it to make sure that you're not going to create other side effects, and using that as a fecal microbiota transplant to treat Clostridium difficile. That is an FDA-approved medical treatment. There are other indications for which fecal microbial transplant has been evaluated, and now they're even doing like viral transplants. I recently heard at a meeting recently, which is super cool. So there's a lot of research into more of those kinds of medical treatments and drugs. But like I said before at the beginning, that drugs, medical foods, and dietary supplements are all different categories. Medical food is a very unique category from a medical perspective, that it's still for a diseased population or a population that has a condition, not necessarily a disease, but a disorder or some other type of condition. And a medical food is intended for the dietary management of a disease or a condition. And it's also intended to be used under the supervision of a physician. And this is a category that the FDA has created to open up some possibilities and not restrict kinds of treatments that could be available. And I guess I shouldn't say treatment, because it's not like a drug, because it's not treating the disease directly or the symptoms directly, but it is providing a dietary and nutritional support that can still result in meaningful outcomes for that person's condition, but is rather indirect and may be addressing specific nutritional components. So for example, there are some medical probiotics that are under this medical food category. Like there's one that is addressing intestinal dysbiosis for intestinal conditions. And then, like I was talking about PS128 in autism and other neurological conditions, we consider that a medical food in terms of addressing these unique needs that are present in autism and Parkinson's disease, et cetera, right? So we see in these neurological conditions a difference in the gut microbiome of these people versus people who don't have these conditions. We also see that there are different patterns in the brain. And in the preclinical studies, we can mimic that with decreased serotonin and dopamine in the brain. And then you see that the probiotic increases the serotonin and dopamine in the brain. So this gut microbiome to signaling pathway is very important, and it could be disrupted in these neurological conditions. So to support that gut microbiome to brain signaling pathway in a medical food way, that's addressing a distinct nutrient requirement where you can't get that in regular food. You can't get that in a regular diet. But by taking a probiotic like PS128 that has been derived from a fermented food, you're providing that dietary support for that gut microbiome to brain signaling, which supports how the body needs to support neurological conditions and behavior. And that's also related to the gut-brain axis. I just want to mention a little bit about the gut microbiome to brain signaling pathways, right? Because it could be through increasing availability of tryptophan or tyrosine, which are precursors to serotonin and dopamine. So by the bacteria in the gut altering those nutrients, that's one possible mechanism. Another possible mechanism is immune modulation. So especially during stress, our immune system is also impacted. Bacteria in the gut can affect the immune system and different immune signals to the brain, which could affect serotonin and dopamine levels. And then there's also just the vagus nerve, right? So there's a ton of signals going through the vagus nerve, which typically uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter for communicating from the gut to the brain. And there's so many steps from the gut to the brain that we don't always know all of those steps, but we do know that PS128, when given in the preclinical study, does alter serotonin and dopamine in the brain. And we also see that in the neurological conditions, there are behavioral and anxiety kind of improvements. So that's just one example of a medical food, which is still sort of in a medical category, but doesn't have the same category as a drug.
Are there concerns, or maybe they've already been addressed, with particular medications used in conjunction with some of these probiotics or prebiotics or psychobiotics? Can they have a, sort of a conflict, maybe a synergistically in a good way or a bad way?
That's always possible. So, for example, with the statins, for example, I know that there's a differential response to statins based on the person's gut microbiome. That has been shown in literature recently. As far as probiotics being given at the same time as drugs, there does need to be more research on this. For PS128, I gave you a lot of examples. All of those trials, actually, those people who were taking PS128 in the anxiety trial, they were already on a medication. In the Parkinson's disease trial, they were already on their own medications. And in the autism trials, they were already on interventions. But also be aware that in all these clinical trials, they were under medical supervision. And a medical food, medical probiotics included, are intended for use under supervision of a physician. So if anyone is taking any other treatment that could alter serotonin and dopamine, just like PS128 might, then they should be under the supervision of a physician as to whether they should even, take such an intervention, and to monitor their behavior, their symptoms, et cetera, to determine continuance, discontinuance, dosage, et cetera. So that's always something that they should be aware of, and to look for interactions, because PS128 as a probiotic it's not a drug, so it's not a heavy hitter. It's not going to make those huge jumps, but there could be some people who are extremely sensitive. And so that's why it's always important to deal with a practicing physician who's very aware of serotonin and dopamine and how to manage these conditions.
This is going to be the hardest question you've had so far, so get ready for this one. I know you're the chief science officer, but I'm going to make you put on your COO hat or your CFO hat here. What if you woke up tomorrow morning and they took all of these supplements and they go, guess what? We have too many positive studies here. None of these are supplements anymore. They're all going to be classified as medical grade. How do you pivot? What are the thoughts about that? Are you worried about that? Are you worried about government oversight?
Are you actually, if you're saying if they're dietary supplements and they're going to medical foods, that's actually an easier transition. But if they're dietary supplements and they're going to drugs, I think that's where you're.
Yes, that's where I'm going. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, then you'd have a lot of investment that would be needed to do all the pre-market approval, because an investigational new drug application, an IND, takes a lot of paperwork, a lot of money, a lot of investment. And there are companies that are working on probiotics for drugs like Live Biotherapeutics. And there are other dietary supplements out there that have been in the news because companies are selling them as dietary supplements. And yet the FDA has started to talk about those particular dietary supplement ingredients as drugs. So this is happening. And there are lawsuits and litigation around it. So it could happen. There are definitely many people working on those sorts of things right now. Yet, even the ones that I'm thinking about in the dietary supplement world, I still see companies selling those dietary supplements that are sort of hanging in the balance as to whether the FDA will continue and say this is a drug, or whether the courts will decide based on, the appeals of the whole industry saying, hey, this is a natural product and it's a supplement, it's not a drug. So it's an ongoing debate, really. It could happen, and there might need to be a pivot, or there might be more litigation, like is happening with some of these other ingredients out there in the market.
Yeah, it's always intriguing to me when people have supplements, or companies have supplements that are almost overly successful. You look at something like CBD. Now there's all these studies out. There's certain pediatric seizure related things where CBD is very useful for. It's like, well, then that crosses a fine line. Does that become a drug that now pediatricians start to use, and now CBD can't be classified as a supplement anymore? So it is interesting to what the government is going to do if they're going to step into these situations. But I want to ask you about ratios. Are there specific ratios of micro gut biome that we should see in the average person? Like how many different sorts of pockets? Are there millions of different strains inside of me right now, or are there only maybe 4 or 5 and I have 20% of each?
So there are trillions of gut microbes in the gut, and there are many strains. Like most of the gut microbiome studies don't necessarily even go to the level of strains. They're identifying bacteria on the genus level, or maybe they'll go down to the species level. But going down to the strain level takes more cost, more time.
Well, what if you stay at the highest level? Sorry. So if you stay at the genus level, what is the ratios?
So there used to be this idea that this ratio of Bacteroides to Firmicutes was considered associated with health, especially with obesity or leanness. But that thinking has been reversed by later studies. And there are other studies where they look at different types. And I don't think that we have a great idea of saying our ratio is perfect. Mm-hmm. There might be some microbiome test companies out there who are still using the Bacteroides to Firmicute ratio. There might be other microbiome companies who are using other types of ratios, or just highlighting certain genus, right? Like they're probably looking at Lactobacillus, Bifidobacteria, Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium prasinense. They're probably looking at these, but it's really challenging because the microbiome test companies are often using different microbiome test methods than a lot of what the research was using. And so they might actually have their own proprietary data and their own proprietary standards, and they're comparing using their own data set. And it's not published, so we really don't have a way to verify, validate, or test in a transparent manner, right? There are some studies in the literature, like this gut microbiome health index that was used by someone, and this whole group looked at a lot of publicly available microbiome data that was just open source data. It was just publicly available, and they could just download all that data and then analyze it. And it didn't necessarily show some of the same patterns that we might have expected from some of these other studies, where you generally think akkermansia is good, but in some conditions it's higher than healthy controls. And then Faecalibacterium prausnitzii is typically a keystone biomarker that's usually thought of being essential and being important, particularly against inflammation. So you'll see lower levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii in some of these inflammatory bowel conditions like ulcerative colitis, or you might even see it lower in colorectal cancer. And then on the other hand, akkermansia muciniphila, you'll typically see that lower in some of these metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity, hypertension, et cetera. But that wasn't necessarily showing up as some of the most important species in this gut microbiome health index that this one group did. And they looked at a ton of data, right? But there is this push toward international harmonization and international standardization, because there is so much variability, not just in the microbiome by itself, but also in test methods, like how you're extracting, how you're purifying that DNA, and then how you're sequencing that DNA, and then which reference database are you using to say, like, this gene means this microbe. There are different databases. So there's a push toward standardizing this so that everybody is sort of using the same language, so to speak. And I think we need that international standardization so that we can understand what is a healthy ratio, what is the gold standard microbiome. We're not there yet. And there are so many microbes in your gut to look at that I think we still have a lot of research to do in that area.
From a consumer perspective, on our end, I go to the store and it's, I look at all of the different probiotics, prebiotics that are available. Should I be thinking about this like I would think about a multivitamin, wherein I don't necessarily need to have a problem, but I'm going to go ahead and use them anyway? Or are you associating each individual strain with just fixing a problem rather than just taking them for overall health and wellness?
So there are those two competing thoughts, right? Like taking multi-strain probiotics as a multivitamin to help you with all of these different conditions, or even just to flood your gut with a whole bunch of good bacteria because maybe you have lower good bacteria because of antibiotics or other kinds of conditions and situations that you've had. And then there's the idea that let's just look at which particular strain or strain combinations, it could be a pair, it could be 5, whatever was tested, has actually shown a benefit in this condition and population. And I would say that most of the scientists, researchers, and industry are on board with the specific strain for a specific disease, particularly with the 2018 publication by McFarland and others that talks about strain-specific, disease-specific probiotic efficacy. And, that was about 5 or 6 years ago, but it's still showing true today. ISAP, the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, the International Probiotics Association, these various organizations are recognizing, look, these are the strains that help for these particular conditions. So that's what we can recommend from actual scientific evidence.
Tell us about some of your company's products like Nurali Mood and why maybe your company does things differently than other companies. You don't have to throw anyone else under the bus, but what you may do differently that some companies do not.
So we're very focused on neurological health and mental health conditions, like I mentioned. Nurali Medical Probiotic is the flagship. It's the original. It's the Lactoplantabacillus plantarum PS128. So one of our main differentiators is all of the scientific studies behind the strain. PS128. Like I said, there are 4 studies in autism. There's actually a study in Tourette's. There's a study in Parkinson's disease, study in anxiety. And then with Nurali Mood, there's the probiotic and postbiotic combination for stress. That's the dietary supplement. Nurali Medical Probiotic is the medical probiotic for the neurological conditions. So we focus on providing high quality products that, they follow the current good manufacturing practices. Like I mentioned before, we have scientific studies behind the strains. We show the evidence. We also have a huge outreach. So Nurali and Bened Life is focused on, reaching out to the community and partnering with them. So not only have we had research on these strains, but we're also still doing research on these strains. There are multiple studies on clinicaltrials.gov right now. And I'm very excited to work with Jack Gilbert, who's a big microbiome expert at University of California, San Diego. And he's going to be designing a clinical trial for us. First, the process will be to survey autistic adults to find out which outcomes are interesting to them. And then Jack Gilbert will be designing a trial with those autistic adult outcomes in mind and testing PS128 for autistic adults, because PS128 has mostly been studied in autistic children. So that's the Nurali Medical Probiotic side. And then the dietary supplement Nurali Mood for mental health, because so many people just want to manage their stress better. PS128 by itself has been studied in stressed workers. It's been studied also in areas of physical stress, randomized placebo-controlled studies in triathletes, for example, which also showed an impact on the gut microbiome, interestingly enough. And the heat-killed or the heat-treated PS23, the postbiotic in there, has been studied in a randomized placebo-controlled trial in stressed nurses and showed an improvement in their stress perception and their mood, etc. So, and even also with the lowering of the stress hormone cortisol. So we have preclinical studies and clinical studies behind these probiotics and postbiotics. We're continuing to advance research. We do stability testing on our products. We control the manufacturing conditions. So we have all of these mechanisms in place to provide quality and efficacy. And then we have our education on our website. We also have our community outreach. We work with Culture City, which provides support for sensory needs. And we just, talked at a conference recently. We were talking about South by Southwest. I moderated a panel where we were interviewing autistic individuals and then also talking to researchers. How do we bring the autistic adult perspective to further autism research? And that's why we're doing this new trial with Jack Gilbert. Like I said, nothing about us without us is the tagline. So we want to have the best science, and we want to have the community outreach to support people with neurological and mental health conditions.
Noelle, this has been fantastic information for my audience. Why don't you let them know where they can find more about your company, the supplements, and then also where they can reach out with any questions?
Sure, yes. So Bened Life, BENEDLIFE.com, has the Nurali Mood supplement for mental health, and then also has Nurali Medical Probiotic for neurological conditions. You can contact our customer service for any questions. We have Instagram, we have Facebook, and let me know if you have any other questions.
I'll put all the links in the description. My guest today has been Noelle Patno. Thank you for joining the Trulyfit Podcast.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.